It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
The geoengineers have overplayed their hand, or should I say our hand, given the fact that the entire ship is now sinking, aka our world. From CNN, global water cycle, the hydrological cycle, our rain, is off balance, CNN states, for the first time in human history, threatening half the planet's food production. Let's stop there. First lie. Not half the food production, all of it. The drought deluge scenario, the hallmark of climate intervention operations, atmospheric aerosol dispersions, and the frequency transmission manipulation of the same. What could go wrong? And for the record, the rain that does fall is toxic, all of it, everywhere, no exceptions, lab test proven fact, not speculation, theory, or hypothesis. The CNN report continues, humanity has thrown the global water cycle off balance for the first time in human history, fueling a growing water disaster that will wreak havoc on economies, food production, and lives, according to a landmark new report. No mention of the single biggest factor in the equation, climate engineering. Not the only factor. Too many people making that mistake again and again and again, thinking it's just a this or that equation. No, it's all the above. Every form of human activity that affects the energy balance of the planet, the planet's life support systems, all of it is a part of the problem. But the intentional intervention, aka climate engineering, aka weather warfare, biggest single factor. They continue. Disruptions to the water cycle are already causing suffering. Nearly 3 billion people face water scarcity. Crops are shriveling and cities are sinking as the groundwater beneath them dries out. Causes what's called subsidence. The consequences, CNN states, will be even more catastrophic without urgent action. What kind of action do you think they mean? 75 years of climate intervention operations ongoing and accelerating? What wonderful results we've had from that. Human activities, they say, are altering the fabric of our land and the air above. Yes, certainly the air above, isn't it? Again, no mention of climate engineering officially, though, which is warming the climate, intensifying both wet and dry extremes. How many times have I pointed out again? Climate engineers control the drought deluge scenarios more than any other factor. And CNN says, sending wind and rainfall patterns out of kilter, quote. They say decisions made in one country can disrupt rainfall in another. No, not can, not could, not may, not might, does. All the above, all I just covered, all is inseparable from climate engineering operations that most of the world is still pretending aren't raging in our skies. More from CNN, the global water crisis is a tragedy, but, CNN says, is also an opportunity. Yes, how incredibly Orwellian. Bad is actually good. Weather warfare is actually an opportunity. And CNN would be correct in this sense. Weather warfare is a very temporary opportunity for the disaster capitalists and controllers, though none of it will matter much if we remain on the current course, because if we do, no one will be here. No one gets out alive on the current course. Not speculation, not conjecture. This is a statistical certainty. Think about these current statistics. Global insect populations, terrestrial and aquatic, down 80 to 90%. Global fisheries, pelagic fish, the food fish, down 90%. Global wildlife populations in the last 40 years alone, conservatively down 70+%. Tree populations since the dawn of civilization, down 66%. And they're no longer producing oxygen or absorbing carbon the way they could, should, and have. And now, in this report today, in this broadcast, vindication of what I've said for 15 years on that exact subject, an acknowledgement from the climate science community of exactly what I've stated for 15 years. I'll get to that shortly in this broadcast. Stay tuned. Final excerpts from CNN. Disruptions to the water cycle are, quote, deeply intertwined with climate change, the report found, and climate engineering, which, of course, again, they don't mention. CNN wants us all to pretend climate engineering isn't real, no matter how obvious and inarguable it is. Final excerpt from CNN. The report paints a grim picture of human-caused disruption to the global water cycle, the most precious natural resource that ultimately sustains our livelihoods, end quote. The consequences will be even more catastrophic without urgent action. Again, CNN repeats that. The water crisis threatens more than 50% of global food production, already stated, patently false, threatens everything, everywhere. And then, again, they repeat the without, quote, urgent action part, referring to climate engineering. And again, I ask, how's that going so far? Over 75 years of planetary life support system disrupting and biosphere contaminating, weather warfare. About CNN, a week ago they put together an incredibly pathetic and transparent climate engineering denial, quote, just a conspiracy theory hit piece on Alex Jones and myself. CNN rolled a clip of my interview with Alex from the previous week. If you want to view this desperate CNN climate engineering cover-up piece, go to InfoWars and find the first of my two recent exchanges with Alex a week ago and this week. And the CNN bit is in the beginning of the second exchange with Alex. Next, more bad news. The point of this broadcast is exactly that, to cover what others won't and aren't. From SciTechDaily, scientists warn of irreversible damage in 2024. This is a climate report. They say the future of humanity hangs in the balance. That's a simple equation if you simply stand back and look at the facts. How many times have I tried to state that exact conclusion? The SciTech article states the 2024 climate report highlights a dire global warming trend with increased disasters and irreversible tipping points, calling for drastic policy and behavioral changes to prevent catastrophic outcomes. They say we're already in the midst of abrupt climate upheaval, which jeopardizes life on Earth like nothing humans have ever seen. Again, with the state of the planet, so many even now denying that there's any warming in spite of records being shattered day in, day out. Is climate engineering making that worse? Yes, absolutely. I've never stated otherwise. But the point is, it's a this and that equation. If we want to build bridges, if we want to advance this fight forward, stand on this narrative, that there's no legitimate discussion about climate anything from any perspective without first and foremost addressing climate engineering, period. Nobody can rationally argue with that from any side of this equation. So the bottom line is, let's build bridges, let's move this fight forward, let's stop the insanity in our skies, and then we can fight about the rest. So again, about this SciTechDaily report, more truth and more lies. The planet's life support systems are absolutely imploding. 200 years of industrialized, militarized insanity with climate engineering at the top of the list is core to this equation. And about the lies that, quote, the drastic policy and behavioral changes will prevent catastrophic outcomes. That's straight from this report. Don't hold your breath on that one. It's comparable to what I've made mention of so many times. Pretending you can put a new set of brakes and tires on the car after you've crashed through the guardrail and are hurtling toward the bottom of the abyss. Far too many of the so-called climate experts are even now pretending that climate engineering is just a proposal that could save us from ourselves. Thankfully, some from academia are beginning to tell the truth. Let's add this from CIEL, that's C-I-E-L, that's the Center for International Environmental Law. Why geoengineering is a false solution to the climate crisis. It's no solution at all. It's weather warfare. The report states, once dismissed as science fiction, geoengineering has started to enter mainstream climate disclosure. Very much so. In fact, so much so that they're doing their best to marginalize the very subject, aren't they? This report continues, despite being at odds with international law and subject to a de facto global moratorium, an alarming number of geoengineering field experiments are planned. The whole world is a geoengineering experiment. Look up, please. Tell the whole truth, not just part of it. They say, or are underway. That part's true. Many driven by voluntary carbon markets. Behind the shiny facade of these highly speculative techno fixes, geoengineering is fraught with risks. That's an understatement. Uncertainties, another understatement, and dangers that threaten to delay real climate action and cause more harm than good. Much more harm. Solar geoengineering, they say, is inherently unpredictable and risks further destabilizing an already destabilized climate system. How many times have I said that? Pushing us from the frying pan into the proverbial fire. They say models show that it would have an uneven effect regionally and could exacerbate climate change in countries on the front line of the crisis. Of course, do we think that the world's largest military, the U.S. military, with I think it's as much funding as the next 10 biggest militaries combined, that they're going to really take care of Haiti as opposed to the east coast of the U.S., where all the Matrix minions live that are in government, most of them, many of them. It's the most densely populated part of the U.S. And interestingly enough, the most anomalously less warm region in the entire world for now about 12 years running is the eastern half of the U.S. lower 48. Is that just an amazing coincidence? Or is that the result of the world's biggest military by far keeping the biggest percentage of U.S. citizens confused and divided as to the true state of the climate? While here in the West, again, it's like living in hell. In between months and months of record high temperatures, no humidity, no rain, everything dying, we get an occasional batch of drifting, toxic, aerosolized moisture come over us. A few drizzles come out, strange scents. If you really have a sensitive nose, you can smell this. And then it moves on. Quick flash cool down, followed by heat. Same is coming for other parts of the country. I'll get to that. The report says it's impossible to test geoengineered technologies for their intended impact on the climate without large-scale outdoor deployment, by which time any harmful and potentially irreversible impacts would be locked in, and indeed they are. How many times have I said this on this broadcast? We can't undo what's been done. All we can try to do is salvage what's left of the planet's life support systems. There's no going back. At the end of World War II, governments around the globe, with ours at the forefront, committed populations to a climate engineering Manhattan project from which there is no return. Keep that in mind. They say in this report, climate engineering technologies would have to be deployed at a truly unprecedented scale. Yes, that's a fact. The math is shocking on this, how many aircraft they have in the sky and what additional damage just the flights are doing, let alone what they're dispersing, let alone the frequency transmissions that are used to manipulate this toxic payload. They say about these flights, with enormous political, social, and environmental consequences already there. The United Nations Human Rights Council's Advisory Committee has warned that geoengineering technologies, quote, could seriously interfere with the enjoyment of human rights for millions and perhaps billions of people. Is that what you call mortality for untold millions? The loss of their enjoyment because they're no longer here? They say the development and deployment of geoengineering technologies are also potentially inconsistent with a wide range of legal obligations and principles under international law. Do we think governments care? Did they ask our permission when they detonated 2,400 nuclear bombs all over the planet, contaminating everything for practical purposes forever in many cases? And the 500,000 Americans, 500,000, no less than 500,000 according to a recent study, that died as an indirect consequence of the Nevada detonations, and then they took the rest of that waste and shipped it down to the South Pacific and buried it in a sarcophagus that's now disintegrating. How many people know that? The Nevada waste was shipped to the South Seas, buried in a concrete sarcophagus, which is now disintegrating and sinking under rising seas. It's going to rear its head again soon, along with Chernobyl. That sarcophagus is disintegrating. And I hear from people still now, oh, they wouldn't do this to themselves. No, they would never risk their own lives, their children's. How many examples do we need? How many do we need? And they're building more nuclear bombs now, by the way, and more nuclear power plants, all of which are going to go into meltdown when society collapses, and that's inevitable at this point. I don't know how we get out of this. I know we need to try to focus on the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat, and that starts with stopping the intentional intervention in the planet's life support systems. If we can do that, perhaps we can then face other issues, and no matter how dark the horizon looks, who can say what allies we may yet have that we are completely, as of yet, unaware of. And unfortunately, many even now are attempting to make climate engineering operations into a red-blue issue, politicizing it as if those who truly control the levers of power are a member of either manufactured political party. They aren't. The scripted political factions are all part of the orchestrated divide and conquer strategy of the powers that shouldn't be. Here's another puzzle piece to consider. From treaty-accord-gc.ca, treaty number E103819, agreement between Canada and the United States of America relating to the exchange of information on weather modification activities. Here's a small excerpt from this report. The government of Canada and the government of the United States of America, aware because of their geographic proximity that the effects of weather modification activities carried out by either party or its nationals may affect the territory of the other. This is the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Again, at geoengineeringwatch.org, we have many government documents, Senate documents, primary one to examine. Search geoengineeringwatch.org, massive Senate document. It's 800 pages long. You don't have to read through the entire document. You can look at the yellow highlighted parts, and that will give you a very good idea of what's there and how damning that document is, and any denial of the ongoing climate intervention operations and the intergovernmental cooperation on these operations is simply ludicrous at this point. From the World Economic Forum, use of weather manipulation tools stokes geopolitical tensions. From that report, weather manipulation tools such as cloud seeding to induce or suppress rain. Hear that clearly, induce or suppress. Many people don't yet understand that climate intervention operations are much more effective at diminishing and dispersing precipitation than they are at augmenting it, though they do both very well. They say that these programs are not new, but deploying them at scale is becoming easier and more affordable. It's affordable if you don't care about a dead planet, a completely contaminated dead planet, and clearly these operations aren't benevolent. I want to make that very clear. They are malevolent about power and control, period. The World Economic Forum report then states, as the impacts of climate-related changes and weather patterns intensify, the incentives to turn to technological fixes will increase in affected areas. Think of governments trying to manage simultaneous declines in rainfall and increases in water demand. That's all happening right now. The climate, the atmosphere is a battleground, along with being a worldwide physics experiment. The WEF report then says, aside from the potential environmental consequences at a time of increasing geopolitical tensions, even well-intentioned weather manipulation, there is none, might be viewed as hostile. Perceptions would be paramount. A neighboring state might see a large-scale cloud seeding operation as a theft of rain or the reason for a drought. Like the leaders of Iran on the floor of the UN stating emphatically NATO was cutting off their rain. How many Americans know that? I wonder why they don't like us in the Middle East. Cloud seeding, the report says, might be viewed as a dual-use tool for espionage as well as weather manipulation. Hostile uses are prohibited but cannot be ruled out. Of course they can't. For example, weather manipulation tools could be used to disrupt a neighbor's agriculture or military planning. Now, our government would never do that, would they? And if states decided, the report says, unilaterally to use more radical geoengineering technologies, it could trigger dramatic climate disruptions. You mean like right now? Final excerpt from this WEF report. As technologies evolve and deployment increases, increased transparency about who is using what and why would help limit destabilizing ambiguity. So they say, it would activate discussion and collaboration on environmental vulnerabilities, both bilateral between bordering states and on wider regional and global multilateral platforms. Yes. And we all believe in Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy. They will never, ever be transparent. They will never willingly disclose these operations. The liabilities already created from completely derailing the planet's life support systems makes every single climate cataclysm a liability to every single individual involved, either actively or passively, period. Keep that in mind. They will never willingly disclose these programs. It's up to us. It's up to us to cause a tidal wave of awakening so that people understand what they're being exposed to, so they open their eyes, look up, activate their sense of reason, and start behaving accordingly. That needs to happen now, not later. We don't have later. Let's look at this, the National Weather Modification Policy Act of 1976. From that act, the National Weather Modification Policy Act of 1976 was a law that directed the Secretary of Commerce to study the state of weather modification science and technology. That act also required the Secretary to submit a report to the President and Congress with the study's findings, conclusions, and recommendations. And they're telling us they know nothing about this? Let's continue. The Act's goals include studying weather modification. The Secretary is to review the state of scientific knowledge and technology and the feasibility of negotiating an international agreement on weather modifications. Long since been there. As I've stated in this broadcast, we know matter of historical record, Soviet weather modification scientists were here in the height of the Cold War touring U.S. weather modification facilities, and our scientists were there touring theirs. That's the kind of backdoor collusion and cooperation that's been going on. This Policy Act then states developing a national policy. The Secretary is to develop a national policy on weather modification, recognizing the potential of weather modification. The Act acknowledged the potential of weather modification technology to help with weather-related disaster and hazards. No, nothing's been used to help anything. It's used as a weapon of power and control, period. And even the very premise of cloud seeding, think about that. How simple is that to understand? If you artificially cause precipitation to fall in one place where it was migrating somewhere, it didn't get to that somewhere. Never made it, did it? How can this be considered anything but weather warfare from any perspective? They then say the Act also requires companies that intend to engage in weather modification activities in the United States to provide a report to the administrator of NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, at least 10 days before the activity. That's all they have to do. So here in California, where we can no longer, not only can't buy a generator, can't buy any small engine anymore, that's the law now because of the particulate matter, and CARB, the California Air Resources Board, patently ignores the dumping of tens of millions of tons globally, or annually also, much of it over the state, because it's not in their jurisdiction. How do I know that? Because I've spoken to the CARB board in front of a room full of farmers that were being made to change their engines to updated engines that they couldn't afford to do because of the particulate matter being emitted. And I told those farmers in front of the CARB board that they were being scapegoated for this particulate pollution while CARB was looking the other way at a source of particulate pollution that's perhaps 100,000 times greater. And I made the CARB board admit in that meeting that they don't care. They're not concerned with climate engineering anything because it's not in their sphere of jurisdiction. Think about that. We live in a world of total insanity. Total insanity. Last excerpt from this UN Policy Act. The UN General Assembly also adopted the UN Convention on the Prohibition of Military Use of Environmental Modification Techniques. This international treaty, also known as the Environmental Modification Convention, (INMOD), prohibits the military or other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. Nobody cares about that. Nobody is going to adhere to this law. Question, does anyone that's even slightly awake actually believe that the global controllers give a damn about treaties? They don't. They never have. And for those that haven't yet put all the puzzle pieces together, from conflict zones to climate engineering operations, the same core of control is pulling the strings while endlessly printing the money it needs to do so, at least for the moment. The powers that shouldn't be are more desperate and dangerous now than ever before. Will they stand idly by and do nothing as populations begin to awaken to what's been done to them without their knowledge or consent? Or will the controllers very soon play much bigger cards? That blank isn't hard to fill in. This is Dane Wigington. You're listening to the weekly installment of the commercial-free, non-political Global Alert News Report, the End of the World as We Know It broadcast, brought to you by Geoengineeringwatch.org, the largest and most visited website in the world on the subject of global climate engineering operations, aka weather warfare. Reaching a critical mass of awareness is the only way forward in this fight. We can and we absolutely must reach a critical mass of awareness. Start by triggering a conversation on climate engineering that leads people to a credible source of data. Credibility is key. Geoengineeringwatch.org will continue all of our efforts to be the go-to source on covert climate engineering operations. A conversation on climate engineering can easily be started with Geoengineering Watch awareness-raising materials available on our home page. This includes printed materials, shirts, hoodies. This can kick off a conversation that can start a wave of awareness in your circles. Please help us to sound the alarm. Moving on, about hurricanes. Are more manipulated hurricanes scheduled for the U.S.? Who can say with certainty except the climate engineers themselves? Only time will tell. What about the blatant, glaring, historically provable lie that governments can't manipulate the weather or hurricanes? Hurricanes create an immense amount of energy. Yes, that's true. But does that mean it takes an immense amount of energy to affect or manipulate a hurricane or a hurricane's path? How much energy does it take to talk to someone on the other side of the world with a small handheld device that isn't connected to anything. If you even mentioned this 100 years ago, they would lock you up, literally. How much energy does it take to turn a speeding diesel truck that can weigh 100,000 pounds or more? A simple turn of the steering wheel is all it takes. A child could do it. How much power does it take to change the direction of the most massive and heavily loaded freight trains, some weighing many millions of pounds? It takes a single person. Even a healthy youth could do it with a manual track switch or a solenoid with a few hundred watts of power. That's it. You can divert the direction of a train that can weigh millions of pounds and in some cases can be over 4 miles long. This is an inconceivable amount of kinetic energy when it is moving, and yet a single individual can alter the course of that much kinetic energy. How is this possible? Consider that just because any given scenario includes an extreme amount of energy, kinetic energy, doesn't it all prove that it takes an equally extreme amount of energy to impact the trajectory of the scenario in question? So back to the manipulation of hurricanes. In 1947, Project Cirrus, the U.S. military dispersed some 80 kilos of dry ice into a hurricane that was already on a trajectory, taking it safely out to sea. What happened next? In fact, let's take a direct quote from earthmagazine.org. Here it is. On October 13, 1947, a U.S. military plane flew over the storm and dumped 80 kilograms of dry ice into the storm's swirling clouds. What happened next, they say, was a worst-case scenario. Instead of dissipating the storm, furiously it swung around nearly 130 degrees to the west and smashed into Georgia, where it caused $2 million worth of damage. Threats of lawsuits soon followed, with Georgia residents blaming the government for the devastation. Project Cirrus, the manipulation of hurricanes, was all but shut down before it truly began, and any research into weather manipulation was repudiated for decades. First, consider that this small input altered the atmospheric chemistry for a much larger region, and now we have patented processes of frequency transmission manipulation on top of this massive result from an extremely small input. But of course, the U.S. military, after this event, aggressively denied any connection to the experiment. They now say that the hurricane in question with Project Cirrus was already going to make this extremely anomalous 130-degree turn. Nothing to see here. Go back to sleep. And about Project Cirrus, the manipulation of hurricanes, officially being, quote, all but shut down, end quote, not even close. It was only made covert from then on. Much like the behavior of the Chinese government when they openly announced that they were engineering snowstorms, they did several $1 billion worth of damage to Beijing. This is in 2009. Anybody can research this. Search Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorms. Popular Science covered it. MSNBC, The Guardian, everybody covered it. But they just went underground. They just quit talking about it and started to deny it. Sound familiar? How many remember the recent unprecedented flooding in Dubai? 2 years of rain in 6 hours. All official sources initially admitted weather manipulation was a factor before they changed their minds or were told to change their story by the manipulators of the Matrix, and that's exactly what they did. Total denial after initially admitting to weather manipulation. And was it just a coincidence that only days earlier Dubai announced it wanted to ditch the US dollar? I think not. And for the record, Geoengineeringwatch.org captured satellite imagery from the Persian Gulf the day before and the day of the Dubai deluges. Signature frequency transmissions were shockingly visible in cloud canopy over the Persian Gulf. A final thought about the smallest of things doing grave damage, a nano-sized pathogen. What can that do? That blank's not hard to fill in. Bottom line, consider and investigate the entire horizon before forming a picture of what is and what isn't. Moving on, about the weather in the lower 48 U.S. states, specifically in the West, some got the updated scheduled weather script and some didn't. A script which ultimately comes from private defense contractors and geoengineering patent holders and participants, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. The so-called forecasts are all over the board, literally completely different scripts depending on the source you search, and the entire long-range forecast often change from hour to hour. First, according to the climate engineering cover-up actors at the Weather Channel, there were some 180 firestorms incinerating in the rapidly dying forests of the western U.S. Next, the engineered transition from heat and firestorms to chemical cold, and even both at the same time. Atmospheric pressure zone manipulation, extreme surface winds in the U.S. West with red flag firestorm warnings, and chemical snowstorms. Welcome to the world of chemical ice nucleation cloud seeding. See the engineering winter section on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org to learn much more. Search the engineering wildfires section while you're at it, even the engineering drought section. There's information there that everyone should know, learn, and share. From MSN, heavy snow to make travel impossible in parts of Montana. Again, this is from record warm temperatures, flash freeze, some regions dropping 40 and 50 degrees in a day. This MSN report says travel could become impossible in parts of Montana this week as winter storm brings heavy snow to the state. National Weather Service meteorologists have warned. From Newsweek, winter storm warning issued for 3 states. They say drive with extreme caution. Yes, do drive with extreme caution. Chemically ice nucleated frozen material contains surfactants. Surfactants are what makes soap soap. Surfactants are a core component of climate engineering dispersions to keep the particles from coagulating together, and the result, incredibly slick, heavy, wet, so-called snow that's almost impossible to navigate in, even for those that are experienced with doing so, and even for four-wheel drive vehicles. More Newsweek headlines. Freeze warning for 19 U.S. states. In spite of the summer from hell we just had, warmest summer in the Northern Hemisphere by far. They say as temperatures plummet, temperatures plunge 30 degrees in hours for 4 states. It's, for the record, actually 40 degrees or more in a single day for some locations. Keep in mind, this is a shallow layer of surface cold. It won't last long in most regions. Next, from Newsweek, the schedule weather, this headline: California atmospheric river forecast. Big changes in storm path expected. Not expected, scheduled. This is recognized technology. The manipulation of atmospheric pressure zones, which can then in turn steer upper level wind patterns like the jet stream, which steers moisture. The climate engineers control the spigot, so they will now likely flick the switch from 6 months of hellish heat and dry to perhaps toxic deluges. At least that's what they have scheduled for the moment. Please listen carefully to this next breaking report. At least it's breaking from the so-called science community. I've warned about this exact scenario for over 15 years. The forests are not respirating. This is a VPD scenario, vapor pressure deficit, because atmospheric chemistry has been so radically altered, and climate engineering is the core to that equation. And though this Guardian report doesn't mention the agricultural impact, the same scenario is playing out with our food crops, which are also collapsing. Here's the headline from the UK Guardian. And I can't fully express how dire this report is. Again, this is exactly what I've tried to warn about for so long. Here it is. Trees and land absorbed almost no CO2 last year. Is nature's carbon sink failing? ? The report then says the sudden collapse of carbon sinks was not factored into climate models. How many times have I said that? They simply omit what they don't want the public to know, and could rapidly accelerate global heating. No, not could, not may, not might, is. Obviously, the collapse of Earth's carbon sinks is radically accelerating planetary meltdown. Climate engineering making it worse still in the attempt to hide it. The Guardian report continues. Together, the planet's oceans, forests, soils, and other natural carbon sinks absorb about half of all human emissions. No more. No more. Consider the runaway train we are now on. But as Earth heats up, scientists are increasingly concerned that those crucial processes are breaking down. In 2023, the hottest year ever recorded by far, and we're at about 50 years in a row, about 600 months in a row, consecutive months in a row of above normal global temperatures. Does that sound like global cooling or a coming ice age? When will that narrative die? And that narrative does nothing but cover the tracks of the climate engineers. We need to look at facts, and yes, we all don't like Al Gore, we don't like the environmental groups, we don't like AOC, neither do I. But we need to deal with reality, not make a false reality because we have disdain for certain people that are capitalizing off disaster. They say in 2023, again, the hottest year ever recorded, preliminary findings by an international team of researchers show the amount of carbon absorbed by land has temporarily collapsed. There's nothing temporary about this. Let me make that abundantly clear. It is not temporary. The final result was that the forest, plants, and soil as a net category absorbed almost no carbon. Let's include the Amazon. How many times have I said this on how many broadcasts? The forests have become a carbon source, not a carbon sink. Amazon burning to the ground right now. Northern latitude forest not far behind. Tens of millions of acres burning annually now, typically, and the trees that haven't burnt are dying anyway and releasing carbon. They then say, there are warning signs that C2, Greenland's glaciers and Arctic ice sheets are melting faster than expected, which is disrupting the Gulf Stream ocean current and slows the rate at which the oceans absorb carbon. For the algae-eating zooplankton, melting sea ice is exposing them to more sunlight. A shift scientists say could keep them in the depths for longer, disrupting the vertical migration that stores carbon on the ocean floor. What else is killing plankton? How many times have I covered that? Geoengineering is destroying the ozone layer, releasing incredibly intense UV radiation, bombarding the sea surface, which is frying plankton. Now down 90% in the Atlantic, other oceans not far behind. No plankton, no people. More from the Guardian report. We're seeing cracks in the resilience of Earth's systems. We're seeing massive cracks on land. Terrestrial ecosystems are losing their carbon store and carbon uptake capacity. The oceans are also showing signs of instability. Nature has so far balanced our abuse. This is coming to an end. This is all from the Guardian article. They continue. Rising temperatures, increased extreme weather, and droughts are pushing the ecosystems into uncharted territory. Climate engineering is so core to all of that. Models have not factored in the losses. That's not an accident. They're trying to mask the severity and immediacy of what's unfolding. They say, like extreme factors which have been observed. Absent from the climate models is the basic fact that trees die from drought. This is observed, and none of the models have drought-induced mortality in their representation of the land sink. Even a modest weakening of nature's ability to absorb carbon would mean the world would have to make much deeper cuts to greenhouse gas emissions to achieve net zero. Net zero is a total sham. Let's keep that in mind. The COP climate conferences, total sham. Smoke and mirrors behind closed doors. They are forcing nations to actively and passively participate in climate engineering, which is the same as actively or passively participating in our own self-extermination. They then say Finland, which has the most ambitious carbon neutrality target in the developed world, has seen its once huge land sink vanish in recent years, meaning that despite reducing its emissions across all industries by 43%, the country's total emissions have stayed unchanged. More from the report. The issue of natural sinks, carbon sinks, has never really been thought about properly, they say, in political and government fields. It's been assumed that natural sinks are always going to be with us. That's like assuming that Santa Claus will always show up on Christmas, isn't it? Total delusion from the so-called climate science community, not by accident. They say the truth is we don't really understand them, and we don't think they're always going to be with us. What happens, they say, if the natural sinks, which they've previously relied on, stop working because the climate is changing? Too late. There is no what if in this equation. The Guardian report then states, we have been lulled. We cannot see the crisis. For the past 12,000 years, the Earth's climate has existed in a fragile equilibrium. Its stable weather patterns allowed the development of modern agriculture, which now supports a population of more than 8 billion people. Not anymore. The great dying has begun, with the controllers doing their best to accelerate the process on countless fronts. We, all of us, each of us, must summon the courage to fully face the gathering storm. The single greatest leap we could collectively make in the right direction at this late hour is to fully expose and then halt the ongoing atrocities taking place in our skies. If we can do that, we would at minimum buy time to do yet more good. That's worth fighting for. Till our last breath. You're listening to the weekly installment of Global Alert News, the Bad News Broadcast, installment number 480, October 19th, 2024. This is Dane Wigington, your host. Global Alert News is brought to you by Geoengineeringwatch.org, the largest and most visited website in the world on the subject of climate intervention operations known as geoengineering. Recordings of the commercial-free, non-political Global Alert News broadcast can be found on the homepage of Geoengineeringwatch.org under the recent column and on the Dane Wigington YouTube channel. I want to express my deepest gratitude to everyone that's marching forward in this fight. It's our collective efforts that can still make a difference at this late hour. Please help us to share the groundbreaking documentary, The Dimming, which fully exposes the climate engineering atrocities. The best way to share: circulate the direct link to the dimming by email directly from the homepage of Geoengineering Watch. Sharing directly helps us to overcome social media censorship. I need to skip the rest of this announcement because I have so many breaking headlines to cover. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. The planet is completely unraveling and the power structures maneuvering as fast as they can. But to help us sound the alarm, on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org, see the activist suggestions link for specific instructions on how you can help to move this fight forward. And our awareness-raising materials, printed materials, sweatshirts, hoodies, all of them extremely effective at starting a conversation on this incredibly dire issue. We are running out of time quickly. My only mission in life is to expose and halt what's happening in our skies. 20 long years I've slogged in this fight, and I will never stop. As long as I'm standing, I will be engaged in this battle. Moving on from UK Guardian, it's mind-blowing. U.S. meteorologists face threats as hurricane conspiracies surge. The report says meteorologists tracking the advance of Hurricane Milton have been targeted by a deluge of conspiracy theories that they were controlling the weather. Abuse and even threats amid what they say is an unprecedented surge in misinformation as two major hurricanes have hit the U.S. That's their proof that there was no manipulation involved because some power structure paid so-called experts said so. From NBC News, storm forecasts have never been more accurate, they say. Meteorologists say they've never faced so much pushback. That report says meteorologists have been falsely accused of steering hurricanes toward Florida or Appalachia, and some have reported threats of personal attacks or online threats. First, this question: has anyone heard of any specific meteorologist that was accused of steering a hurricane? I haven't, but about government agencies as a whole, that's another question. This being said, all investigative communications and sharing of information on this issue should always be kept professional and peaceful. Bottom line, Matrix Media pushing the narrative that the so-called weather experts are completely honest and accurate with their forecasting, aka script reading. These experts that somehow know, for example, that a particular day a week away will be, quote, mostly sunny or, quote, filtered sunshine, days that may not have a single natural cloud, only the overstory of geoengineering jet-sprayed, dingy aerosol clouds. How do the so-called experts know so far in advance that this will occur? But don't worry, the power structure programmed experts with their certificates of indoctrination from power structure controlled institutions can always be trusted, just like the entire field of experts that have pushed the safe and effective narrative for decades. How do they know Hurricane Harvey a week in advance would go where it did and stay there for days, dumping 50 inches of rain? How could they have possibly known that? And another example for the record of this script reading that goes on in the so-called meteorological community, how could the so-called experts know a week in advance that Hurricane Harvey would go where it did and sit there for days dumping 50 plus inches of rain? Please search geoengineeringwatch.org, Hurricane Harvey, and you can see that we recorded the frequency transmissions that held that storm in place for days. Please examine it, decide for yourself. We've recorded other events, Ian, Maria, Michael. Please examine our hurricane posts and the frequency transmissions that were recorded which manipulated these storms, and about other false narratives from Matrix Media and from some online disinformation sources that we're just seeing jet exhaust in our skies. Forget the retrofit nozzles that turn dispersions on and off. Forget the climate engineering elements showing up in patents, hundreds of tests all over the globe. Forget all that. It's just jet exhaust. And that the total energy of a hurricane is so immense that it can't possibly be steered, so they say. Again, both conclusions, both narratives are patently false, as already addressed on this broadcast. And I've also seen a source recently state that sea level rise can't happen because if you put your ice cubes in a glass full of water and they melt, the glass doesn't overflow. And I can't imagine what that has to do with anything. We're not talking about sea-based ice. No one that I know of in the climate science community, geoengineeringwatch.org included, has ever stated that sea ice would raise sea levels. It's land-based ice, and when you have up to 3 miles thick of land-based ice that melts and goes into the sea, you will definitely see sea level rise, and it's already completely devastating South Sea islands and many coasts along even the US. There's no speculation involved here. So again, if you see something online, somebody making a claim, please dig a bit deeper. Use your sense of reason, compare all the puzzle pieces, and form a picture that's accurate. Only by standing on credible data and conclusions can we move this fight forward. And again, it needs to start with stopping climate engineering. And there can be no legitimate discussion about climate anything from any perspective without first addressing that. Please keep that in mind. Moving on, so with all that we just addressed about what meteorologists are dealing with regarding so-called conspiracy theories, which are certainly not a theory at this point, mountains of data to back up the manipulation of the planet's weather, let's rewind to this 2016 report from USA Today. Weather Channel meteorologist's death ruled a suicide. Here's a question: what would happen if a qualified individual knew that models were being falsified and that these operations were ongoing, and that person carried enough weight to actually put a break in the dam to bring this issue out in the open? What would happen? Let's continue with this 2016 USA Today report. According to the Weather Channel, Nick Wiltgen was a senior digital meteorologist who had worked at the station for 15 years. A senior digital meteorologist, a field of expertise that would certainly have made Mr. Wiltgen aware of the filtering and manipulating of weather maps and climate modeling, which would certainly be routine in regard to masking scripted weather and climate engineering cover-up. Consider all of that. With that in mind, let's add this. From the 2016 report from the dailynews.com, parents of Weather Channel meteorologist Nick Wiltgen have questions about suicide ruling in his car crash death, mother says. Wiltgen's parents did not accept the official conclusion about their son. Clearly, they didn't believe he would do this. How did Nick die? His car accelerated wildly into a concrete wall. So, might there be more to the story than the official conclusion? You decide. And might such an event keep the rest of the climate engineering cover-up cast at the Weather Channel and elsewhere in the weather script reading community towing the line for the Matrix, obediently reciting the scheduled weather script, no questions asked or answered? Again, you decide. Back to the weather experimentation from NPR News. Idaho experiments with new way to boost snowfall in warming world. Scientists first started seeding, NPR says, in the 1940s. No, earlier than that, with climate intervention operations, SRM, geoengineering first fully deployed immediately after World War II over the polar regions and expanding out from there. On Monday of this week, literally overnight, the entire 14-day weather forecast from AccuWeather, aka the scheduled weather script for the western U.S., was completely altered. All 14 days in a matter of hours, and then somewhat back again. They're all over the board. With that in mind, this from Newsweek: freeze and frost warnings issued for 11 states. After the warmest summer on record, we have this in mid-October. They say the cold snap is about the size of the Midwest and New England, with frost advisories and freeze warnings in 11 states. These cold conditions, they say, could threaten crops and plants around the region. No surprise. Timing is always there. Flash freeze, flash drought, flash flood, flash hail hitting agricultural regions. I've cited that again and again and again. They say frost and freeze conditions could kill crops, other sensitive vegetation, and possibly damage unprotected outdoor plumbing. That's from the National Weather Service. They say those with agricultural interests should protect sensitive vegetation. Really, how are you going to protect miles and miles and miles of orchards? The cold may also damage pipes and plumbing, they say. And for the record, far above normal temperatures are scheduled to return to the same region in the days after this chemical flash freeze, which has even hit North Carolina, as if they have not already been weather warfared enough. The chemical ice nucleation cloud seeding distracts many from the ongoing planetary meltdown. On that note, from ColumbiaInsight.org, extreme heat represents a new threat to trees and plants in the Pacific Northwest. This report is from late last year, but it's important to hear and to plug into the larger picture. A growing number of scientists are investigating what they say is an overlooked threat to the world's plants. Seattle and Portland, Oregon recorded their hottest ever temperatures, reaching 108 degrees and 116 degrees respectively. In British Columbia, the small town of Lytton reached 121 degrees. Think about that. 121 degrees In British Columbia, the report then says recent research suggests tree foliage didn't simply dry out in the heat. Instead, it underwent widespread scorching. The report continues, and browning of the leaves was just that the leaves cooked. It really wasn't a drought story. A growing number of scientists investigating what they say is a new, woefully underestimated threat to the world's plants, climate change-driven extreme heat. And now let's add the off-the-charts UV radiation due to the collapsing ozone layer. Core causal factor is climate engineering. With that in mind, more from the report. Sunburned forests. In recent years, scientists in the Pacific Northwest have linked the decline of 10 native species to drought. In many cases, conditions that have brought about the decline are known as hot droughts. Driven by above normal temperatures, hot droughts can be far more damaging to trees than droughts that result simply from a lack of moisture. Hot droughts not only dry out soil, they also dry out the air. This stresses trees and can cause water-carrying tissues inside them to collapse, a process called hydraulic failure. The journal Tree Physiology states that damage to the region's trees during the heat dome was triggered primarily by direct damage from heat and solar radiation, aka UV, rather than indirectly by drought caused by the extreme heat. Foliage scorch, they say, was primarily found on the southern and western sides of the trees and forests, a pattern that follows the track of the sun across the summer sky, like a sunburn across the entire forest. Stop and ponder that. A sunburn across the entire forest. And even now, the off-the-charts UV radiation, including UVC, a DNA-damaging spectrum, isn't even being measured, let alone disclosed. This isn't an accident. It's yet one more attempt to keep the population from panicking until the last possible moment. Functional collapse of the ozone layer. No food, no plankton, thus no fish, starving populations, collapse, and chaos. Welcome to the asylum. On that same subject, let's add some excerpts from this U.S. government document, Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025. From the document, 2 key technologies are necessary to meld an integrated, comprehensive, responsive, precise, and effective weather modification system. Advances in the science of chaos are critical to this endeavor. Also key to the feasibility of such a system is the ability to model the extremely complex, nonlinear system of global weather in ways that can accurately predict the outcome of changes in the influencing variables. They continue, researchers have already successfully controlled single variable nonlinear systems in the lab and hypothesized that current mathematical techniques and computer capacity could handle the systems with up to 5 variables. Advances in these areas would make it feasible to affect regional weather patterns by making small, continuous nudges to one or more influencing factors. Conceivably, with enough lead time and the right conditions, could get a made-to-order weather scenario. Final excerpt, concern about the unintended consequences of attempting to, quote, control the weather is well justified. Weather is a classic example of a chaotic system, i.e., a system that never exactly repeats itself. A chaotic system is also extremely sensitive. Minuscule differences in conditions greatly affect outcomes, aka small input, huge result. Again, this reminder example, Project Cirrus, all the way back in 1947, 80 kilos of dry ice strategically dispersed into a hurricane reportedly altered its course by 130 degrees, forcing it to make landfall where it otherwise would not have. This was, of course, later officially denied. Nothing to see here. Move along. And yet, we are still told even now that the manipulation of large storms isn't possible, though the historical record and available science says otherwise. Denial of climate engineering and storm manipulation is a lie, not just from government sources and matrix media. Some online sources that actually claim to be fighting climate engineering are pushing the same lie. And both sources just mentioned also continue to push the "it's just jet exhaust," mind-numbingly obvious lie. And about the constant river of lies that we're all drowning in, this timeless quote: "The result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that the lie will now be accepted as truth and the truth be defamed as lie, but that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world and the category of truth versus falsehood is among the mental means to this end is being destroyed." That's a quote from Hannah Arendt. Now, more than ever before, we must all nurture, strengthen, and follow our God-given senses of reason and logic. The ongoing total disruption of the planet's remaining life support systems, including the destruction of the ozone layer that's taking place in skies all over the world, must be exposed and halted. These operations are also simultaneously contaminating the entire surface of Earth, along with every breath we take. A groundswell of awareness has indeed now been triggered and is building quickly. We must stoke this fire, each of us, all of us. Sharing credible data from a credible source is key. Check the activist suggestions link on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org for specific input and instructions on how you can help to move this fight forward. Please make your voice heard, make every day count. Time is not on our side. Global conflict will likely be the next card that the criminally insane controllers play. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington from geoengineeringwatch.org.